Welcome, everyone. My name is Craig Hukuma. I'm a pastor in Acton, Ontario, and I'm here with Curtis Malista and Dave Beelen, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a second. But first, I want to say a bit about the conversation that we're going to have together today. We're going to be talking about navigating a divided environment in a way that's faithful, so in a way that isn't afraid to speak the truth, but also that is gracious and knows when it's time to maybe hold our tongue and not inflame or unnecessarily offend. Um, Dave was interviewed by Abide back in February of 2022 by Dave Bosher. And so this was just months before the Synod 2022 vote. And Dave, one of the things you said back then is you said, we don't really know how this is going to go. But you correctly predicted that even if Synod is very clear and very firm, which it was, that we're going to be navigating a divided environment for a while. And that is definitely where we're at now. Um, so all three of us are or have been ministering in environments that are pretty divided on the decisions of Synod the last 3 years. So I sort of have two hopes for this conversation. The first is just that any others who are listening who are ministering in divided environments would at least be encouraged, even if we don't share any earth shattering wisdom, just to hear some other leaders in the church who are navigating similar waters. I hope that that can be encouraging. And then the other thing that I think about, maybe more importantly, is I hope that this conversation helps fix our attention on the question of what it means to please Christ in all of this. I don't think any of us want to stand before Christ and have him say, "Hey, you know what? You did great with that whole, standing up for the truth of what my word teaches, but you did really poorly in terms of what I said about um, how to treat your fellow man and fellow woman." Um, so I hope that maybe we'll have some things to say about that will fix our attention on a well-rounded understanding of what it means to honor Christ in the midst of all this. So, Dave, I'll start with you. Just let you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your ministry history and what you're doing in ministry now.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, David Beelen. I was pastor at Madison Square Church for 38 years. So I started there in 82 and went to all the way to 2020, the beginning of 2020, just before COVID hit. And so I've been in Glasses, Grand Rapids East my entire ministry. And I still, Madison Square has three sites. I go to one of the sites where people left under my leadership to go follow one of our associate pastors. And so that was a blessed parting, but they had already chosen another pastor to be their primary pastor. So that I didn't see it at the time, but so that when I retired from leading that congregation, I could still be involved in the church, but not be in this awkward position of still attending the site that I was preaching at most of the time. I have three children, and they're adults, and two of them are married, and one's on her way. In fact, I'll do my third wedding of children this summer. I have three grandchildren, and I started teaching at Calvin Seminary. I think I was a cheap utility player off the bench for them when they needed someone to lead in pastoral care or preaching or spiritual formation, theological education, as I forget the name of the course now, but David Reilersdan teaches that. Anyway, they would invite me to come in and teach those courses, which I'm still there one day a week. And then I also work for Coram Deo. We have a robust training program for commissioned pastors. So, and I do some one-on-one coaching for leadership and preaching. Been married to Melanie for 49 years, so next year we celebrate 50 years. She's like good wine. She just gets better with age. So that's enough from me for now.
Thanks, Dave. I'll send her a link to this when it's posted so that she can hear you say that. Curtis, what about you? What is your ministry experience? What are you doing now? Tell us a bit about your family too.
Yeah, my name's Curtis Malista. I live in British Columbia, Canada, and from 2017 to 2022, I was a youth pastor at Willoughby Christian Reformed Church in Langley, British Columbia, and now we live a few hours north of there, and I go to Calvin Seminary full time through the hybrid MDiv program, seeking ordination in the Christian Reformed Church, and I have the pleasure of getting to be part of the Abide Project and doing some of these podcasty sort of things. I've been married for 14 years. We have 5 children, and yeah, when I was at Willoughby, we definitely navigated some turbulent waters when it came to kind of the standard, what might seem pretty boilerplate CRC issues these days, and just different views on how the church should respond to cultural understandings of sexuality and whatnot.
Thanks, Curtis. So I'm currently serving in Acton, Ontario. I've also served in Ottawa and in Sarnia. And so I've just been in Acton not even a year yet. We moved this past summer, and I am married and I have 3 boys who are all teenagers. My oldest is in university; he's at Lakehead in Thunder Bay, and the other 2 are both in high school. And my wife and I have been married 23 years this summer, I believe. I think I'm getting that right. Um, and yeah, so I've, I'll say, I guess I'll say a bit more about the kind of the contexts that I've been in with regard to conflicted perspectives. But I'm actually going to let you start with that, Dave. Tell us a bit about, you mentioned you've been serving in Grand Rapids East your whole ministry, and you've shared a little bit in some of your previous interview with Abide back in 2022. But yeah, tell us a bit about your experience navigating a divided environment.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. Um, well, I've had to follow my own advice, which is it's a fool's errand to try and guard your reputation. What you need to do is guard your integrity. So I think all pastors, leaders, can easily be tempted by the approval idol or people-pleasing idol. And so it doesn't mean I don't ask the elders sometimes to help me with unfair characterizations, but guarding my integrity is what I needed to do. Um, I've always felt like clarity is kindness, and there were people who were coming out to me and saying I'm gay back in the late 80s and early 90s. So remember, I started pastoring in 82. So I was having conversations in the pastoral study, and I started preaching series of sermons on sexuality about every, oh, say 3 years during that time period. And I always touched on homosexuality. So mainly the thing I was saying to the congregation at the time is we've got to cut the gay jokes and the fag words and that sort of thing. I didn't feel like I had to spend much time on the Bible teaches this as in the category of sexual immorality. That sort of flipped around as time went on. I'll try to keep this short because some of it will be repetitive of that other conversations, but that was 3 years ago. Um, Grand Rapids East put together a committee that was going to explore affirming biblical studies and then present that to the classis. And that committee was formed. I think there were 8 people on it, and all of them were affirming in their theology. So they asked me, would you be on it? We need a counter voice. And I said, well, given the mandate to the committee, I'm not going to fit this. And so another month passed, and they invited me back in along with an elder in our congregation. So I served in that committee, and then the report came out. And while it was going on, we were meeting for about a year. I thought I should write a minority report. I didn't have time for that. So I just wrote something on the very bottom, which said, or at the end, which said, it was a good experience to be part of this group. We treated each other with care and kindness. I disagree with the conclusions of this report, but I do think we need to talk about this. In the meantime, I had written a letter to our congregation about same-sex sexual relationships, and I think it was about 10 or 11 pages. and naively, we just sent it out email and didn't say, don't pass this on. And it sort of blew up. It went all over the place. And I don't mean nationally. I just mean within our sort of network in our congregation, so their relatives and so on. So that paper generated conversations with other people, not necessarily um, in our little circle. And then things marched on from that. I was the only person when this report was considered by our classes, the only person who got up and spoke against it or spoke some warnings about it. One of them being, for example, that the Koreans I was talking to, the Latinos and the African Americans, to a person, were urging us as a classes to not go down this road because they couldn't follow. So I'm not saying all Koreans, all Latinos, and all African American pastors or leaders in the Christian Reformed Church um, say they want to maintain the historic view, but that was certainly true of the people I was speaking to. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Dave. Curtis, you mentioned your time in Willoughby. You had to navigate some division around this question. Is there any more you want to share about that?
There was nothing terribly formalized in terms of like what Dave was sharing about, study reports and whatnot. But there was definitely a group within the congregation who had a desire to have an affirming view or lean to that direction at the very least, and did something from the congregation to kind of put that forward, like hosted some talks and things like that. But really what it boiled down to was just kind of an undercurrent of division among the congregation where it seemed like there was two congregations within the church. And when other tensions entered the church, namely COVID, unfortunately, um, those lines kind of became drawn a little more starkly. And so and then just pastoring that environment was just a challenge because if you wanted to use, kind of conservative resources about anything, you kind of got looked at by some of my colleagues with a raised eyebrow because, everything was kind of tied up into just a more progressive theology. And so if you wanted to kind of push anything historic, it was looked at with some suspicion.
We're using we're using some shorthand language here that maybe I'll just clarify a bit. When we say historic or historic position, we're basically referring to the position that the Christian Reformed Church holds. And when we say progressive, we might be referring to basically any perspective that says synod shouldn't have done what it did, shouldn't have stood where it stood. For myself, I was serving in Classis Eastern Canada in Ottawa when synod had the votes of 22, 23, and 24. Our classes, I think, sent 3 or 4 overtures that were in some form against the HSR. I spoke or wrote against all of those overtures. And so I wouldn't say that the vast majority of classes Eastern Canada is affirming, but I think at least the higher percentage when it came time to vote just didn't want to see us fighting about these matters. And we're trying to navigate the non-confrontational course. So there were times I felt like a minority, not necessarily in the theological position I held, but in feeling like this is important enough that we need to have a clear stance. And the congregation I served, there was a sizable minority. I'm grateful to say we weren't a congregation where I know of a number of congregations that seem almost like they're split right down the middle, and that is just an incredibly hard position to be in. Thankfully, we were not in that position at Calvin. We could chart a course forward, but it did mean a sizable minority of the congregation was either quite upset, many left. A huge chunk of my pastoral care ministry for at least a year following Synod 2022 was meeting with people who were not happy. So, and then my sense, I'm new to Classis Huron, but my sense of Classis Huron is it's fairly similar to Classis Eastern Canada. So I'm still getting a sense of the degree to which it's divided, but I think it's probably fairly similar to Classis Eastern Canada. Dave, you gave some good advice already. I like your phrase about protect your integrity rather than your reputation. Um, but I'd be happy to hear more about anything you've learned about what it means to navigate an environment, a divided environment with both grace and truth, and any advice you would have for pastors and leaders in similar settings.
Sure. So one of the things that I think I learned over time is I set up my pastor's office in such a way that, let's just say, because of the way the screen is here, that I'm the person that you're talking to. And see behind me, there's that a plaque there. That's where a large clock would be. So when I'm listening to this person, I can, without moving my eyes, I know exactly what time it is back here. And usually it was the expectation is there's about an hour that I'm going to talk to my pastor. And my rule of thumb was, even if within the first 5 minutes they are presenting me with a scenario and wanting me to respond to it, give them the answer. Um, my rule of thumb was I am going to ask questions of them for 30 minutes before I start saying, well, let's look at Matthew chapter 5, or let's have you considered this? I would often say in the first 5 or 10 minutes, um, Mary, I want to engage your question and answer, give a response anyway. But let me ask, I want to make sure I understand. Let me ask some more questions. So if you set that into this conversation, for example, especially in the days when it seemed like people hadn't settled down in their commitments, they would say they were wrestling with this, or I think um, we should marry same-sex people, something like that. I would say to them, well, what have you studied or thought about? Is there a book that was a game changer or a video? Or they would sometimes just come up to me and give me something. And as pastors, that happens over and over again. Please listen to this. They'll send you a link. So it kind of wore me out, but I knew that if they were going to listen to me, I needed to listen to them first. So I would read the book. Like James Brownson's book was, I don't remember the title right now off the top of my head, but James Brownson's book, read this, Pastor. It's a game changer. I read it twice. The second time I wrote notes all over the place. I wrote a 4 or 5 page review of that book because it was said to be, from the Reformed perspective, that treated Scripture with good Reformed hermeneutics. This is the best thing out there for the affirming position. So I wrote a 4 or 5 page review of that, and then worked through it with the elders of our congregation. So let me just boil it down to saying this: that listening is really, really important, and not making assumptions about where people are at or where they're coming from. And so many times I'd find out it was a daughter or a daughter-in-law or a son or a cousin or an uncle that they're wrestling with this conversation. So it was very personal to them. And if I didn't ask enough questions, I'd never know that was kind of the strongest motivation behind their wanting to talk to me about this. Let me just say one more thing about, I guess I would call this in the advice category because it was so good for me. Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, subtitle, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to the Sexual Revolution. It's about a 400-page book. I read through it I gave it to a bunch of other people. We had a book study of it, a couple leaders in our congregation. Um, and two things came out of that for me. One of them was I realized the task I had just about identity was a lot bigger than I thought it was, because this has been 300 years in the making. So I thought, I've got to preach and teach about identity, sexual as well, but identity a lot more than I was doing. And then secondly, it gave me compassion for the people in the pew who have been formed by 300 years of Rousseau and Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, even though they would think, oh, no, I haven't. It's just in the water, so to speak. And they've been so formed by it that their moral intuitions are toward affirming. And if I didn't recognize that and deal with it and understand it, I might become hard and um, judgmental rather than recognizing that. And not only did it affect them, it affected me too. So I highly recommend a close and leisurely read of that 400-page book. If there was such a thing as a Christian reformed pope, I would want to be that pope for 30 minutes and then order all the priests, pastors, to read this book.
If I may be so self-serving, I did write a sort of summary slash, not really a review of that book, but a bit of it has a bit of a summary for Abide that's on our website, but it was back in probably 2022. So if people want to at least get a flavor for what's in that book, there is an article on the Abide website if you
There
search
you,
for
yeah, you
Carl
don't have
Trueman.
to read 400 pages. Just read Craig's summary of it.
Hopefully, mine is just to whet the appetite.
Okay.
He also Crossway also published This Strange New World, which is like kind of the lay version of Rise and Triumph. Because Rise and Triumph is quite a bit thicker than this. This is, 170 pages. So if people don't want to deal with the more academic work, this is a more accessible work. Strange New World by Carl Trueman.
Yep. Good.
Curtis, any advice you have for navigating a divided environment?
I See, I don't have the advantage of 38 years that Dave has. But it was my first charge as a youth pastor, walking into uh what I refer to as a legacy church. Before it was called Willoughby, it was First Christian Reformed Church. And so you've got people there that have been in that church for many, many decades and are loyal to that institution to a fault, and they care deeply about it, which can be a really powerful force in a positive direction and also a really negative direction. And then in comes this young upstart youth pastor who wants to change things and change the fabric of the community. And so I feel like a lot of my experience is in reflection on it was just blundering. But I think the key, at least in our situation in a multi-staff church, was um, having good, deep, real friendships with the people that you work with. And so I had that with our senior pastor. We're dear friends, and that was a lifeline as we navigated these issues. Because unfortunately, a lot of the division in our church was at a staff level. Um, and so having at least one other staff member in which we were united wholly was a lifeline. Otherwise, it would have been like you're on a sinking ship by yourself, is what it would have felt like. Um, but I don't have the same experience as Dave has in that kind of leadership um, category. But one thing that I learned just now that I would pass on is this: listen more than speak, and that's something that is a challenge to me regularly. But in those days when I was young, it was definitely a harder challenge, especially when it came to council meetings and speaking with elders, trying to figure out where people come from. the thing that came to mind as Dave was speaking was it's not polemics, it's people. And I think we can get distracted thinking it's polemics. And I think every kind of theology nerd and most pastors there's a theology nerd that lives deep inside who loves to come out and debate the finer points of doctrine. It's easy to think, oh, here's a fun polemic. Let's get going, and forget that there's people behind it. And so I think that's an area where I failed, was trying to understand um, why people in our congregation thought the way they did, rather than just see them as coming to incorrect conclusions.
Yeah,
I,
thanks, Curtis.
I've got a bit of a follow-up on that because Curtis is saying, here's what I wish I'd done differently. I've got some of those myself. Um, I think I preached about sexual ethics and grounded it somewhat in doctrine, but didn't ground it in the drama. So I've recently written something. I lead these cohorts called The Gospel and Human Sexuality for the organization that I work for. And most of them are pastors, many of them Christian Reformed pastors who are in this 8-month cohort that, and Craig was in one of them. So, anyway, I wrote a paper. It's called The Greatest Love Story Ever Told in 3D. So it's drama, doctrine, decisions. And I think if our ethical decisions aren't grounded, especially in the drama that's from Genesis to Revelation of the bridegroom and his bride, then our sexual ethics sort of hang out there, and well, why is same-sex sex? Why does God say no to it? And unless you've laid the groundwork of this bridegroom bride drama and the beauty of it, it just sounds like a no instead of the unfolding of a beautiful plan that God has. And I wish I had run into certain authors earlier, and just been more curious and did better reading so that I would do a catechesis around sexuality that was better grounded in the story of Scripture.
Yeah, I've caught myself along that theme. I've caught myself even reflecting back on wedding meditations, how many times I've referred to um, the language I've used is that marriage is being used metaphorically for God's relationship with his people. And I wouldn't want to put it like that. I want to say, no, God's relationship with his people is the thing, that our marriages are actually the metaphor.
Right.
We're the picture. That's the reality.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, that's really, I think, important theological thinking that hopefully we're doing more of in our midst. One of the things that came to my mind, it's very much in keeping with what you guys have said in terms of advice. So every time I spoke publicly at classes against one of the overtures, I think it was 100% rule. Somebody got up after me and misrepresented what I said.
Mm.
That might be because I didn't say it well. So I'm not passing blame. I'm just acknowledging that in a highly charged emotional environment, that kind of thing is going to be commonplace. And I'm sure that any who are watching this who've been in divided environments on either side or whatever side have felt profoundly misrepresented in conversation, where they want to say that is not what I said, that is not what I hold to. And so I guess one of the things that comes to mind is just be aware you're going to get misrepresented, and don't do your best not to assign that to bad motives. Just assign that to the fact that this is a highly charged conversation, and then do your absolute best to try not to do that to somebody else, because you know how frustrating it is. um, and then, yeah, I guess it fits too with what you said about protecting your integrity versus your reputation. I think often of Christ's phrase, "Why not rather be wronged than do wrong?" um, I think there's, and we'll get into this more, but there's certainly a point at which you need to stand up and defend because questions of teaching are at issue. But if it's just a question of my reputation, I think there's some times where you can say, why not rather be wronged than do wrong? It's hard. It's hard stuff. But um, again, I would rather have the commendation of Christ than to get my point across and understood in
Mm.
every instance. Um, what, if anything, would you want pastors or leaders who are in? There are um, certainly more divided environments, and there are certainly more homogenous environments uh, within our denomination. What would you want pastors who are serving in more homogenous environments? And I'm thinking specifically homogenous in agreement with synod. Um, what would you want them to know about what it's like to minister in a divided environment? What might you want to say to them?
You gonna go first, Curtis, or am I?
I could go first. I think the thing that comes to mind is recognizing that leaders in those situations, um, it's a taxing environment in so many ways. It's taxing in time, as Dave already said. If you want to engage in their sources, that takes a great deal of time. Um, but then the conversations that are had about debriefing the last elders meeting, talking about this pastoral visit that just had, or this conversation that happened in the hallway, along with just the weight that it bears on you. Nobody wants to see your church family divided, and so there's an immense pressure as a leader, as a weight of grief and concern. And so pastors who are in those environments, maybe coming into classes meetings or wherever, come in with a heavy burden and they're quite tired.
Yeah, I've got a friend who here locally in Grand Rapids who's a pastor. And a few years ago, there was a very fraught meeting, and then spillover afterwards. Um, 50 people left his congregation. He lost 20 pounds. He couldn't sleep very well for a year. Um, Lost some very, very close friends, people that were at his table often. Um, I would say, 2, 3 years later, he's he's finally that wound isn't so fresh anymore. And so what's the advice if you're in a place where there's not that kind of fraught feeling, and you have friends that are in the five churches left in Colossus Grand Rapids East that seem like they're not on the road to disaffiliate out of, I think, 16, reach out to that person. It'll take you 5 minutes or less to go find, on the church website, Pastor so-and-so's um, email address, and you haven't seen him in 20 years because you were in seminary together, or within your own classes. You're in an environment with less um, division over this, and someone else. Man, when I would get emails or phone calls or text messages from people back in 2016 when this report from Classes Grand Rapids East came out, it was an answer to prayer. Oh Lord, please encourage me, and I'd get something. So I would say that. Let me say something else. I was what I thought wasn't in a homogeneous environment until the early 2010, 12 in there, and I figured, oh, I better skill up and knowledge up in this area and read because I can see what's coming. Um, I think you have a great opportunity to do teaching. For example, I would take the Great Lakes Catechism, which is 19 question and answers about sexuality from a gospel point of view, and find a way to get that into curriculum of youth group and start teaching on human sexuality so that the young people, because in some ways you're not really in a homogeneous environment. If you believe the social science, 5 to 10 people in 100 member church are going to be same-sex attracted or bisexual, or that's their experience, or maybe even trans. And everyone's on the internet, so they're getting catechized anyway. Um, and I would just say, wow, what a great opportunity you have to not just say, whew, I'm glad I don't have to deal with this. Um, we are in a sexually saturated culture that's full of internet advice. What's the church saying and the pastor saying, and what kind of groundwork are you laying?
Yeah, I've done a lot of thinking, being in a divided environment. What could this environment look different if we could go back in time 15 years and be a little more intentional in our teaching? And so I certainly resonate with that for those who are in um, environments where it's not sharply divided. Recognize that 15 years from now, it could look very different because the culture is profoundly powerful. And so um, being able to address that. The other thing that comes to mind for me is I've found in um, yeah. So let me give an example. I know that when Synod 2023 ended in a difficult way, and there were quite a few who would be in the more abide camp who were quite upset and were very concerned that if this didn't get decided at 2023, then that's something is pretty is wrong, and this is alarming. I actually looked at Synod 2023 being in a divided environment, and I kind of wiped my forehead and went, I'm glad that wasn't decided. Like, my church just needs some time before there's more shrapnel to deal with. Um, so I guess I'm just saying, recognizing that for those who are in divided environments, sometimes what might look like, oh, you're not passionate or on board with the vision here, isn't necessarily the case. It's just recognizing that there are times where some space and some time is going to be needed in a divided environment. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not on board with where the denomination is going, but it didn't take us a week to get to where we are. It's going to take more than a week to get to chart a different course. So I guess just recognizing that when you're in a divided environment, um, needing time and needing patience isn't necessarily dragging your feet. It might be what the situation calls for.
Yeah, that sounds it sounds almost antithetical in a way to what Dave was saying earlier about clarity is kindness. And I don't disagree with either of you. Um, Clarity is really important. I think that was definitely a theme at our synods. But it takes time for people to come to grips with the clarity. And if you go through things too quickly, you're going to cause you lose the ability to take people along the journey. And there is, I think, limits to that because there's definitely congregants or congregations who, want to engage in conversation and listening to the nth degree. And sooner or later, the shoe has to drop eventually, and you have to get on with other things in the church. Um, but it's a good word to recognize that. I think this is my experience in Canada too. The churches in Canada I think tend to be more divided. I think as a country compared to America. I know there's quite conservative pockets in the U.S. and I don't think we quite have that same those same pockets in Canada. And so most churches are going through this. I'm blessed now. I'm part of a Christian church that has no division around this. It doesn't feature in anything, and it's been a really good space of healing and and to just kind of get back to the basics. But I have a question for Dave on kind of on that note, following up what Craig said about preaching. Um, you started you talked about how you started preaching against or preaching into some of these things around identity and against certain kind of false views that get perpetrated on the internet and whatnot. Um, how did you organize that in terms of regularity, and then how was that received? And did you find any, did you discover any fruit from that preaching? Because I think, of course, as a pastor in these environments, the pulpit's a very good megaphone in which to speak into these issues, but you don't want the pulpit to become a an activism place either. It still needs to be proclamation of the gospel. So how do you toe that line?
Yeah. What a great question, Curtis. And you learn by making mistakes. For example, early in my ministry, I preached on the book of Malachi, and there's chapter 3, and there's that section, God hates divorce. So I preached what that word was. And afterwards, I get uh, a two-page letter from one of the elders who has been caring for a woman whose husband had beaten her so badly that he had to care for her by taking her to the hospital and getting stitched up. I didn't know about this, and she had 9 children with this man and was trying to hold things together until those kids were out of the house. Um, so the next time I preached on divorce in that passage, which I don't know, probably 8, 10 years later, I did a paragraph aside. I said, God doesn't hate you. If you're divorced, many of you are, or someone in your family is, they hate divorce too, and they've gone through a knothole. And I just want to stop a moment and pray for you because this sermon is going to, there's going to be points, I think, if I were in your shoes, where it would just be difficult. The topic itself is difficult. This is before people use the word trigger. And so I just learned to do that. And even sometimes to email people beforehand and say, hey, Mary, here's what's coming up this week. And I want you to know I have you in mind, and others. And I hope you're there. And I'd sure like to hear from you afterwards as to how this landed on you can help me to be a better pastor to people who've gone through divorce. Um, so that's true about other things too. Like I had friends in the congregation who were same-sex attracted, and I learned that when I was going to preach on sexuality, and I say it this way because if you preach one standalone sermon on homosexuality, you do it. It's almost like pastoral malpractice because it's in the context of a much greater story. Um, anyway, I would have these friends that I would say, I'm not giving you editing power over my sermon. I don't think I should do that as a pastor. But on the other hand, I would like to know how this lands on your ears and to have kind of a conversation about it because it will probably help me pastor this congregation better. So, I was in one congregation for 38 years. So over time, I got to know people who I could count on to give me that kind of feedback and who I shouldn't talk to about that. Um, I would, well, let me just stop with that for now and see if there's any follow-up or Curtis, you want to say something to that?
Yeah, that sounds like a that sounds like something that you could do if you have a lot of presence and history in a congregation. That's the advantage of being in a congregation for 10, 15, 20 plus years to have that trust and that ability. Um, but I think that also I hear echoes of your first statement about protecting your integrity and not your reputation, because it's a desire of wanting to be a better pastor, not just wanting to be be right or be seen as a certain way.
Mhm.
Um, but as you, I guess now that you're kind of post pastoral ministry in Madison Square, and you're just part of the fabric of the congregation, do you see any echoes of those pastoral decisions and those sermons? Is there still fruit that you recognize from those years?
Yeah, so the sermons, um, so obviously identity comes up around sexuality. But I think there's a broader base of just who are you? What does it mean to be human? And
Hmm.
what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And what's wrong with a culture that says follow your heart? So for years, I would see that um, what do you want to call it? Heresy, or you could even call it pagan. The follow your heart um, catechism of our culture, I would counter it with, and it's, I mean, it's right there. It's low-hanging fruit with the first question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism. But then, so I would say that's a major theme, and I can see that fruit. We're one of the churches in our classes who is not heading down the disaffiliating lane, which doesn't mean there isn't uh, conflict about this or division in Madison Square Church. We're urban. We're in Classis Grand Rapids East. Um, you can almost predict that it will be a fraught situation. People have left our congregation who want to be quite a few actually who want to be in an affirming congregation, and that's been happening over the last 3 or 4 years. But we also get people who say, "Glad you've staked your claim. You say marriage is only between a man and a woman. You're not going to marry people who we can't marry, people who are same-sex attracted." Um, how our congregation, the square, Madison Square, navigates the confessional requirement is what they're trying to work through right now. How do we align? There's this period. What is it? A 3-year period. I'm think that's what it is. So, is there a way to do discipleship in this period, and how do we relate to our denomination? So that um what I did when I left was I wrote a kind of a memorandum of understanding. We called it covenant, but here's what I will do and won't do as I remain with my wife, members of Madison Church. Here's how we handle funerals, or if I get a wedding request, or pastoral care, because I've been there for 4 decades. Um, I did tell them I will not talk to people about present um, conflicts in the congregation. The only people I will talk to is the pastors, and they will invite me in. I won't invite myself in. So I felt like I needed to have that understanding. The elders approved that letter, and it was read publicly by me and an elder, just to be really clear about what this transition means. So I do have conversations, but they're behind the scenes, and they're with the pastors.
Hmm.
We are nearing an hour, I think. One of the things I wanted to reflect on a little bit is um, certainly the passion within Abide has been around the question of what does the church teach and what ought leaders to teach. And of course, that's very closely related to, um, yeah, how do we care pastorally for people who are impacted by these subjects that we're teaching on? And it can be very easy, and I've certainly seen examples. We probably all have where someone's passion about what the church teaches um, is understood or mistaken to be a passion against a particular behavior or against people who are struggling with sin. So I'm thinking about that distinction between a firm stance against false teaching versus a firm stance against sin or sinners. And I'm thinking about that in terms of how do you have a conversation with a congregation member versus how do you have a conversation with a fellow office bearer who is tasked with leading and teaching? Are there are there different principles there? We talked about some principles that probably apply to both, but um, and I guess I'll just read James 3, which says, "Not many of you should become teachers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly." Um, I guess I wrestle with sometimes feeling a different obligation when I'm in the midst of teachers and leaders versus when I'm in the midst of a congregation member. And maybe that's not a clear question, but I can see by the fact that you're nodding, Dave, that you at least get the tension that I'm feeling. And I wonder if there's things we could say about that that might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I need to tell myself, calm down. Um, when I'm in environments where someone who has been taught the hermeneutical principles that I was taught and made ordination vows like I made, and the way that the scripture is handled, I just shake my head and want to put my head down. I think, oh, come on. Um, and so I've got to ask ask the Holy Spirit to guide me, obviously, in those situations. Because James 3 is true, and I can't expect people, you hear um, a biblical approach to affirmative theology, and to someone who isn't well trained in the art of hermeneutics, the science of hermeneutics, it sounds good. And if your moral intuitions are drifting that way anyway because of the culture we live in, I have to have a lot of compassion. But I think for leaders and teachers, I'm actually glad our denomination said there's a higher level of accountability for preachers, office bearers. Um, I think you got to know your own personality. If you lean more prophetic and truth, calm down. If you are more conflict avoidant, take a courage pill. Um, Sometimes I need a courage pill, and I go listen to someone who's a courageous preacher, and I'd listen to 5 minutes of it just to get because fear is contagious, and so is courage, which is also the reason why I think people in your congregation who don't have the courage in their little circles to stand for the historic Christian view of sexual ethics, when their pastor does it, they borrow courage from their pastor.
Yeah, I've certainly felt that obligation at times where even if I know my voice isn't going to have any impact, there's other people in the room who probably just need to hear somebody say something. The other thing I have to be careful with is there's always that part of me. I love apologetics and I love thinking through arguments and I love logic and things like that. And so there's always that part of my brain that says, well, if you just lay it out a certain way, you ought to be able to be convincing. And so for me, entering into a conversation going, well, Craig, if you get this right, if you say this right, you're going to be able to persuade. It's really helpful for me to go, Craig, maybe you need to say something, but you maybe don't need to say a lot. Just because you have to say something doesn't mean you have to say a lot, and it doesn't mean you have to lay out a rock solid case. You maybe just need to say something simple and straightforward.
Amen.
Any any parting thoughts as we wrap up? Any themes that came up that you want to say more about, or questions that we didn't touch on about being in a divided environment that might be worth mentioning before we go? I didn't
Well,
prep you for such an open-ended question, but
no, that's
You know what?
fine. Go ahead,
Go
Curtis.
ahead, Dave. Okay. What comes to mind, and this goes back to kind of the synod decisions around confessional subscription and whatnot. One of the storylines that gets kind of put out there is that if we kind of revert back to um, the way the Christian Reformed Church and continental Reformed churches more broadly have always looked at elders and deacons as in needing complete confessional subscription to our doctrines, um, that somehow we will end up in a place where we will have less available elders and deacons, and that we absolutely need process by which people who disagree with our teachings can lead the churches. I think that is a straw man at best, personally, but I think as we continue to walk through turbulent waters, either at a denominational level or at a local level, or even a more localized level within a local church, I think the call for confessional subscription in our churches is absolutely needed because to some degree the council chambers are a small mirror to the life of the congregation. And if there's lots of division within elders meetings, there's going to be lots of division out in the church body. And so one of the ways I think we can walk through these turbulent waters, these divisive waters better, and hopefully in a way that is godly and a way that ministers to people well, is to have a more unified leadership. And with that, I think also comes a very godly leadership. And so I argue often for tighter restrictions around office bearers than looser ones, because I want good, godly men and women leading the churches. So that way, A, we can be unified around what we teach, and we can live out those convictions in a godly manner rather than necessarily in just a bludgeoning way.
I think two things out of my own experience that was been very helpful to me. One of them is um, conflict or disagreement. May it drive me more deeply into a conversation with our Lord. Um, I want a tender heart. So as I go through ministry and come to the end, when it's time to retire, I don't really like that term. I don't find it in scripture. When it's time to transition, I love the church and I love being a pastor actually more, and I have a more tender heart. Well, the only way you can do that is if your skin thickens. And by thickens, I don't mean it's not impenetrable, but that things roll off you easier, you are not easily wounded, and therefore your heart can stay tender. Because so I went in, whenever I preach, I pray, God, I need a fortified heart, I need courage, and I need a tenderized heart. Could you fortify my heart and tenderize my heart? So prayer is extremely important in leadership anytime, and especially through this. And then the second thing is I spent hours working on this 3D. It maybe it's an extended sermon or a meditation on the 3D. So the drama, the doctrine, and the decisions. And I'd like to share it with anybody who is intrigued by that and would like to read it. I think it's about 20 pages or so. So if you email me, this is a long email address, Dave at corumdeoassociation.org. Coram Deo is a Latin phrase, Coramdeo association, Dave at corumdeoassociation.org. I'd be happy to email it to you and interact with you about it if that's something you'd like to do. And I hope only about 20 of you take it up, because if there's like hundreds, I will be overwhelmed. I'm not interested in writing a book. I'm not interested in making money on it. I just want to, if it's helpful to people, put it out there. Because it was important for me to ground this talk about what's God saying yes and no to in the area of sexuality in the great drama of Scripture, bridegroom and bride.
as someone who's had a sneak peek at uh, Dave's document, I can recommend it as well. So there you go. You're going to get more than 20 now.
I forgot you got a sneak peek.
I did. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Curtis, for your time. And again, for those who are watching this who may be in divided environments, I hope that this is just a maybe a little breath of fresh air from the Holy Spirit to say, hey, there's a bunch of us walking through these challenging situations together, and keep putting one faithful foot in front of the other. Um, yeah, it is helpful to remember how messy things were in the history of God's people from Genesis to Revelation, and to know that we're not in a unique environment in that regard. And Christ still calls pastors, elders, and deacons to just keep putting one faithful foot in front of the other. So press on, fellow leaders and teachers, even if you're not in an official leadership capacity. Um, and thank you, Dave and Curtis, for your help and encouraging.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Greg.